Perfectionism and procrastination. Well, we all know these kind of moments where you say, "Oh, I can really deal well with deadlines because I work better with a deadline, or I work better under pressure." Is this really true? And hardly anyone can say more important aspects of how to solve it properly than the expert we have today, live from the West Coast, from the United States of America. Hello and welcome, Jenniffer de St. George.
Niels, thank you so very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much for taking the time. And now, of course, our question is, because we all know these moments where we procrastinate, which means we don't really get started, then we hesitate what we should do, and then we all just rush it together in the last 10 days before the deadline. And at the end we say, look, I've done it because I can work better under pressure with a deadline. So first, do you think this is true?
I speak as a recovering perfectionist.
Okay.
Somebody asked me the other day what a recovering perfectionist was.
That would be my question.
Somebody who at least they acknowledges they have a problem. We're still working on solving the problem, but at least I know I have it.
Mm-hmm.
So I work in healthcare, and so for the last 5 decades, I have spoken to dentists, left brain. I live in Silicon Valley and am surrounded by computer people, left brain. And so the classic perfectionist is very much that left brain, I don't want to make a mistake. And I often joke, if you really want stress, be a perfectionist married to a perfectionist. So it seems my whole life has been tainted, colored. My father was a perfectionist. He never recovered. He didn't even realize it. So it really impacted my life, and sometimes not in a good way.
Okay, so I assume then there must be a better way how to do it. So after I first asked, do you think that this is true to work better with the data? I assume I can say probably it's not. So second question, how can I do it better? Because as someone who comes from Northern Germany, it is basically our mentality to do everything properly, on time, on a close to or even perfectionist level. And I know all the struggles coming with that. How to do it better?
Well, you've said a key word there, which is most probably the bane of every perfectionist life, and that is time management. The perfectionist will say, oh, I need to write an article. Well, 3,000 word article, that'll take me about an hour. And 3 days later, we're still at it. We have a really hard time in lowering our standards on something that does not need that high standard. So the first thing we have to acknowledge is not everything has to be perfect. And I still fight that. I mean, if I walk into a room and a picture is slightly off, is not even hanging on the wall, I will be the person who walks over and straightens it. I'm still working on it. So to follow up with your question, the biggest problem about perfectionism is it creates procrastination.
Okay.
And that is another problem. So we now have 2 elephants in the room, perfectionism and procrastination, and they go together.
So when I have this problem, and of course this causes stress, and when it causes stress, and I have other people who I have to lead, of course, I might put this just onto others and become a bad leader by doing so, which means I can either lower the motivation of my employees or even raise my employee turnover due to the frustration which I produce. How can I deal better not only with myself, but also when I have to lead others, where I most likely have very little understanding that they are not perfectionists as well?
You are doing an amazing job to focus on the key elements. I'll give you a very quick story, which this brief story actually sums up what you're talking about. I was in an audience one day, had about 600 people in the room. About 50% were, actually, let me rephrase that as I'm thinking where I was. There were about 200 people in the room, and they were dentists only, no staff. And I was talking to the dentist about staff management and working with your team. And I talked about appreciation. And globally, the number one thing staff rate as their number one need from their manager is appreciation. Money ranks about number 5 or number 6. So I'm talking about this, and I ask the audience, dentists, employers only, how do you show appreciation to your staff for a job well done? And this guy stands up. You could not make these stories up. And he says, Jenny, that is a very interesting question. I show appreciation every payday when I give them a paycheck. And I'm looking at him. And I said, and do you tell them how happy you are with how they handle themselves? And he said, well, no, because if they weren't doing a good job, I would have fired them. So
that's really a Northern German approach, yeah.
So I would say to the entrepreneurs and anybody who's listening, who's running their own business or is creative, I go through life with a lot of unmet expectations. Most things do not meet my standards. So when I work with other people, I have had to completely change my communication skills. The old Jenny, I used to have a staff of 8 corporate employees who looked after me and my speaking business. If one of the staff gave me a typed letter, and maybe there were 2 pages, instead of saying, oh, this is really good, by the way, there's a typo in the last line on the second page, the old Jenny would say, there's a typo in the last line on the second page. We don't look for mistakes. They jump out. And I've had to completely change the way I communicate to other people, which, if I may, leads me to the next thing I've learned, is to remove the pronoun you from my communication. I think perfectionists, because we have such high standards, we're seen as negative because we tend to find the thing that doesn't work before we acknowledge the thing that is working. So instead of saying, you have made a typo on the last line of the second page, today's Jenny would say, by the way, there is a typo on the last line of the second page. And I can now go for days without using the word, the pronoun you, because it is so, it's basically setting up the relationship for failure. How come you did that?
Excellent. Excellent. Of course, now many business leaders and also some other people who listen to this podcast, maybe trainers, speakers, or coaches, when they go for a speech, they know the problem that we always say, a speech is never perfect. So you always write it and you always prepare it and think it is good, maybe even really good, but maybe not perfect. And when you leave the stage, you always think, oh, I could have done this, or I could have made a good joke here. How do you deal with the feeling of constantly thinking, I basically delivered a not best performance?
You are asking me these questions, I presume, as a perfectionist, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if I had written the questions out, Niels, I could not have made it any better. So let me take the second one first, just because it hits me. I've done over 1,000 full-day programs in 17 countries, 6 continents, the whole bit. I've been doing this a long time. It never changes. When I get off stage and I get back to the hotel room, I take my program for the day and I immediately critique either the timing, 2 things I'm critiquing, the timing and the order. And I do it while it's fresh in my mind. And that hopefully will never leave me. The first comment you brought up about perfectionism, I'll give you a little story, because my stories, I've learned with audiences, give them a visual picture that they can relate to. Many years ago, I was at the National Speakers Association, and we have an event called Meet the Pros. Some associations call it Meet the Experts. I don't like the word expert, so I like Meet the Pros. And the lady running the table of 10 for the speakers was a lady who, Juanita, she produced audio programs for speakers. And she asked the 10 speakers of us around the table, how many of us had product? And only one person put their hand up, me. And 9 people looked at her, and she berated them. And she said, do you know how much passive income you're leaving on the table? Do you know how poorly you're thinking this through and building a future? And she was literally berating them. And they're looking embarrassed, and they're about to crawl under the table. And finally I said, Janita, putting my hand up, may I possibly ask a question on your behalf of your table of 10? And I turned to them and I said, how many of you are perfectionists? And 9 people put their hand up. Mm-hmm. Everybody had started it, but it didn't meet their standard. And one throwaway line that just happened to me the other day. I was having a Zoom meeting with a good friend of mine, and I said, have you started podcasting yet? She said, oh, yes, I've got 26. I said, well done. She said, I haven't broadcasted any of them. I've got the 26 ready to go. I just don't feel they're good enough.
There we are. Yeah, I know this feeling. Excellent. Excellent. So when we now talk about perfectionism and procrastination, to wrap this whole interview up as sort of final words, how do you work on a daily basis? How does Jenny work on a practical daily way on perfectionism and procrastination, especially on procrastination? How do you work on it in a practical daily way?
Okay. Bottom line, that's what it's all about, because if we don't harness this, then we're never going to move forward. Trial and error. This is what I've learned to do. Let's take very quickly, I need to write a 3,000-word article.
Yeah.
The night before, I write myself a note and I put it on the computer. I need to write 3,000-word article by a date tomorrow for Dentistry Today. And it's sitting right on my computer. When I lie in bed, and some people cannot do it, I can. I will actually think myself into doing it tomorrow morning. Now, this is the key, and it works for me. When I wake up in the morning, Niels, I spend 10 or 15 minutes lying in bed. I start the article in my head. I'm imagining myself at the computer. Mm-hmm. As I walk downstairs, many times I literally don't even stop for coffee, and I find myself on my laptop continuing something I started in my head. And since I started that technique, it has done, for me, it has really stopped that procrastination. I have friends who write articles and they talk about vacuuming the carpet and sharpening the pencils and making the office perfect before they can sit down. And I've got caught into that trap, and one has to stop it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you very much. These are perfect words to wrap this interview up. Of course, I'm going to put your contact details into the show notes of this podcast so people can get in touch with you directly. I can only recommend to talk to Jenny. I saw her speak many times actually around the world. Always a pleasure to have her either at your educational events or as a speaker for your convention. So Jenny, there's only one thing left for me to say for today. Thank you very much for your time.
It was absolutely my pleasure. I loved it, and I love speaking to fellow perfectionists who want to move forward. I think it's a hot subject, and I appreciate it being included in your program.